I did want to just comment a little bit on Cuba and how, like, so many people are like, yeah, I'm against US intervention, but I also support the protests. You know, it's one thing to say that you support, like, the right to protest, you support the fact that these people should be able to protest, right? And it's another thing to say, like, you support, like, at least what is being presented overwhelmingly as the wider goal of the protest, which is basically the complete overthrow of the government, right? So it's one thing to say that you support the right to protest, right? It's another thing to say that you support, like, at least what is being internationally presented as the singular goal of these protests, which is basically, we want capitalism, we want, capitalist style bourgeois democracy, right? And it's also, like, a completely useless thing to say. Like, to say I'm against US intervention, but I also want the Cuban government gone, and I want them to have a liberal democracy with free and fair elections. You know, that's all well and good there, but US intervention isn't going to stop. You can't, pronouncing yourself as being against it isn't going to stop it. That's a worthless thing to say. You're not doing anything with that. You're not providing any sort of alternative, right? Because the US intervention is going to be there. Saying that you're against it, like you have some sort of nuanced position, that's not nuance. It's basically just being a fucking coward and avoiding any sort of meaningful pronouncement. Because theoretically the Cuban government is overthrown and Cuba gets free and fair liberal democracy elections, what's going to happen is that the US is going to intervene in those elections and turn Cuba into essentially a puppet colony with a veneer of democracy, right? So to be against US intervention, but to be for the overthrow of the government and the installation of liberal democracy, that's not a stance. It's basically just a way to try and make yourself seem nuanced when you're not being nuanced at all. You're just being a coward who is supporting US imperialism in a kind of roundabout way. I'm against this thing that is not going to stop under any circumstance, and I'm also for this other thing that would by default be completely compromised and co-opted by the USA, because the intervention's going to be going on anyway. It doesn't make any sense at all. It's just like typical Twitter anarchist sort of thing where, like, they have no grasp on reality. Like basically for them, you either immediately establish like an anarchist, you immediately abolish the state and establish a bunch of anarchist communes, or for some reason you establish a liberal bourgeois style democracy, which they also always accept, and they don't actually consider whether that's remotely practical at all or anything like that. It just feel good idealist bullshit. It's so easy to say those sort of things. It's so easy to say that you're against US intervention and for so-called democratization or whatever, and against authoritarianism, without actually having to put into practical terms what that actually means and how the fuck you're going to stop said intervention into that supposed anti-authoritarian democracy. It doesn't make any fucking sense. The whole like authoritarian versus democratic dynamic doesn't make any sense either, because every single state in the entire world which these people consider to be democratic is actually incredibly undemocratic and incredibly authoritarian. Every single country in the world cracks down on their protests at least as hard as Cuba cracked down on theirs. Every single country in the fucking world. So if that's your example of authoritarian, then, we're going to have to say that the countries that you guys live in are also pretty fucking authoritarian, right? But of course, they have the veneer of like a more plural political system, so therefore they are not authoritarian.
Westerners.
Attention Westerners, listen up. This is important. There's a lot of leftists who have just like consumed hook, line, and sinker the sort of liberal framing of what freedom and like democracy and not being authoritarian means, which is essentially the free movement of capital, like the freedom for capital, basically, more so than anything else. Another thing that I want to point out is that in Cuba, political dissidents, they call them, which is supposed to be like a positive term, are a danger to the state, right? The reason why you can be a political dissident in Europe or in the US openly, you can tweet out saying, I want to overthrow the government, I love communism. The reason that you can do that is because you're not a real threat, okay? The second that you became a real threat, they would throw you in jail far sooner than Cuba would do it. Cuba's government has been at real risk of being subverted by foreign actors for a very, very long time, for the last 60 fucking years. It's just acting like how any other state would do in a similar circumstance. It's not out of line or anything. Now, do I support that personally? as in it from an idealistic standpoint, no, because I don't like states, right? I don't want states to exist. But I mean, I'm just holding it to the standards of other states here by saying that. Fact of the matter is that if the US had like dissidents being funded by China advocating for communism or whatever, and they were actually a real risk to the political status quo there, that would be, every single fucking one of them would be in jail. That's why they jailed and assassinated people a fucking ton during the civil rights movement, for example, during the Red Scare, for example. And I was also going to say before that, like, the definition of freedom and democracy that these people have just consumed hook, line, and sinker, it doesn't include things like, you know, the freedom to have food, the freedom to have a house, the freedom to have healthcare, the freedom to have quality education. None of that. It's all like the freedom to like criticize your government, the freedom to set up a business, the freedom to buy an iPhone direct from the USA without any import taxes. That's the sort of freedom that they're talking about. The fact of the matter is that Cuba's system right now is better than its neighbors, objectively. Does that mean it's perfect? Obviously fucking not. You can't have a perfect political system ever, let alone under the circumstances that Cuba is in. But Cuba has been far more successful than any other nominally socialist state in history, really. Not just in terms of providing people with things that they actually need, but also in the fact that it's been far less repressive. Not even close, right? Like, there's nothing you can point to in Cuba that's anything like, for example, the Stalinist deportations. Nothing even remotely on that level has ever happened in Cuba. And that confuses people a lot because they don't really know what to say about it. So they just end up sort of making shit up, using random phrases like authoritarian, because there's nothing specific to point to. So, if you want to oppose the Cuban government, you have to consider the potential alternatives. Are they going to be worse? It's easy to say, I'm against Cuban authoritarianism and I'm against US intervention, but what is your fucking alternative? Because the only viable alternative currently, at least for another couple of decades until relations between the US and the Cuban government get better, which I hope they do, is going to be the current system. Because the only alternative is that, or the US intervening in what are definitely going to be rigged elections in which agreeable neoliberal is installed who will do the same sort of neoliberal shock treatment that we've seen 100 times all over the world. And I mean, if you want to say that that's not what's going to happen, I mean, that doesn't make any fucking sense, right? Cuba is the most intervened in country in the entire world, and it has been for 60 years. The level of subversion that Cuba deals with is absolutely off the charts. It's far more than China deals with, far more than the US, even probably the USSR ever dealt with, at least on like a per capita basis. It's absurd. It's truly absurd. And there's absolutely no reason for us to believe that the US would not intervene in any sort of like so-called liberal democratic elections. Even those sorts of elections wouldn't be desirable anyway. What would be desirable is the sort of more open, make a more open version of the current political system, rather than just straight up going into like a bourgeois democracy. But yeah, I guess the message there is like, if you're going to say, I'm against intervention, I'm also, I'm against the embargo, I'm also against the Cuban government, what the fuck do you propose that's better then? Do you want Cuba to be like Jamaica, like Haiti? Is that what you want? Because those are the countries that Cuba should be compared to, those of its region, right? And its system is objectively better. The only countries in the Caribbean that are better than Cuba on any metric are, for example, like the Bahamas, which is just a tax haven with massive inequality where most normal people live worse than people in Cuba do anyway, despite the country having far more gross wealth. Another great example is Puerto Rico, which has a massive GDP per capita for Latin America, by far the highest, yet poverty on the same level as any other Latin American nation with the same standard of living for those people in poverty. So yeah, people who complain, like frame things in those terms, don't have any sort of real alternative to offer, right? Like, I have tons of criticisms of China, obviously, but I would never fucking say that I want the Chinese government to be overthrown and have them replaced with a liberal democracy, because I don't think that would be better at all, not even remotely. And just another thing about the protests there is that the levels of police brutality there, obviously police brutality is always fucked up and bad, and even in Cuba, cops are bastards. But I mean, one person died and about 200 were arrested. That's an average fucking day of BLM protests in the USA. Give me a fucking break, man. France killed, what, like 24 people during the Yellow Vest protests over the course of a year or two. And you're telling me that, like one protest death in Cuba gets all of this attention. The first ever protest death in Cuba, by the way, the first ever death of someone killed during a protest in history. The level of attention being paid to this is absolutely absurd. Yeah, I mean, in Colombia, the police have killed at least 60 people in the last few months. Yeah, the attention given to that was nothing, not even close to what has been given to Cuba. One death, relatively small protests of what, like 5,000 people, maybe 10,000 max across the entire island, which, yeah, is significant and obviously worth reporting on, but the pure level of attention given to it has been absurd. Absolutely absurd. Nonsensical. And obviously there's a reason for this, right? It's because attacking Cuba, not only do these media outlets, does the USA, does Europe, etc., want regime change in Cuba, but Cuba needs to be an example. It needs to be presented as a colossal failure in every possible respect, so that people don't get inspired by it to try and do something similar.